And welcome to Professor Gillian Whitlock. It's a particularly great pleasure to mention Gillian here. She is sort of one of my big role models in academia. She is, I think, what an academic, a scholar truly should be, like a person who writes books, who is at the cutting edge of things, who explores ideas beyond disciplines, and just does what an academic and a scholar should do. She has a tremendous track record of amazing books. She's the key authority in the world on issues of narratives and autobiography, women's autobiographies. She has a series of ARC grants, including a professorial ARC fellowship. And what I find is amazing, she is located in English. I'm, as some of you here as well, are located in politics and international relations, but Gillian's work is, as relevant, if not more relevant, than most of what our colleagues do. She really crosses across disciplines, especially as today on issues of refugees and asylum seekers and testimonies. But I won't ramble on. I think we have only an hour so that people can go back to work afterwards. I'll hand over to Gillian, and just want to thank in advance for joining us and for sharing her latest work on issues of testimonies of asylum seekers. And
Thanks, Roland. That's hard to live up to. Thanks for coming, everyone. This is a project that I'm working on with my co-author, Roseanne Kennedy, who's at ANU. Our argument is that there's a distinctive testimonial archive emerging from the camps on Manus Island and Nauru, and our book is called Witnessing Refugees. So what you're going to hear today is part of the chapter that I've been working on documentary. So the particular focus that I'm in for the paper today is a film from the Manus Detention Centre, filmed by the journalist in detention, Buruz Bachani, called Chowka, Please Tell Us the Time. And we'll look, there's a very short trailer, just 2.5 minutes, that we'll look at. So we will have image and, as important really, sound, and a glimpse of how the film has been presented to an international audience since its release last year, June 2017. So the trailer is how it's being pitched. I'm interested in what this film brings to what I would call a corpus of documentary films about the Indo-Pacific camps on Manus and Nauru, and also on Christmas Island. So we have 3 major documentaries now. The first was Eve Orner's Chasing Asylum in 2016, which focuses on Nauru, and like many things from Nauru, is totally dependent on whistleblowers for its material. Chowka, released last year, a documentary filmed by the refugee Buruz Bachani on his smartphone in the camp. Again, typical of something that's happening, not typical, but this is what we're seeing by way of testimonial materials from Manus. And finally, one that was first shown just last month, Gabriel Brady's The Island of Hungry Ghosts, which is about Christmas Island, a performative documentary with a very strong environmental ethos that focuses on the migration of the crabs. It takes a very different approach to talking about migration and what it's meant on Christmas Island and how that relates to the population on Manus. So 3 documentaries, each with a quite different imprint, each coming from a different island location in our detention regime. So I'm arguing then that these have a signature or an imprint emerging from these different locations and jurisdictions in the offshore detention regime. Let me just say a little bit to map out the context for this work on Chowka. I'm working here with an idea that I'm not quite sure about, and I'd be very interested to get feedback on, which is this idea of a Pacific theatre of documentary. So this idea of a Pacific theatre allows me to analyse the production, the dissemination, and the reception of documentary films from these camps. But the theatre here is a conceit. It's not only documentary film, but also the theatre of operations of the Pacific Solution, and more recently, Operation Sovereign Borders. So in this theatre, Pacific refers to these borderscapes, to the constant production, maintenance and renewal of borders in this region. Not only territorial borders, of course, we've got ongoing processes of excision, new legislation restricting access to technologies in the camps and so on. But I'm also thinking about the cultural, legal, social, economic borders, and to the texts and artefacts that are emerging from this distinctive contact zone, these camps which are maintained as places of exception. One of the things that is particularly relevant, I think, to our work as a research seminar with a particular interest in visual global politics is this thinking about theatre of operations. The Australian offshore detention network has to date played a very small role in conceptual thinking about migration globally. So this is a hot topic, a lot happening in this field now, in the humanities and the social sciences, given the surge in forced migration. It's critically important that we can make a case for the kind of distinctive contribution to work on refugees in forced migration in fields like visual cultural studies. So my co-author Roseanne and I are really trying hard to find ways of getting this material beyond the zone of Australian studies, which we much value, but trying to get it out there more generally to a field which is really preoccupied with European context. So it's hard to overestimate the impact of a single image on debates about visual witnessing, and that's one of the things we might want to talk about after this. I think in his presentation to us of his book, Visual Global Politics, Roland spoke about the image of Ian Kurdi when he was making the point that images do things, that images travel globally with extraordinary speed and impact. They're political forces in themselves, he points out, and some images become, favourite word, iconic in a global public culture. Almost at any moment we can see this image referenced as inspirational. So, for example, you might have seen in the weekend newspapers just past, there are reviews of the new book by Khaled Hosseini, author of Kite Runner, called Sea Prayer, a tribute, he says, was inspired by the haunting image of young Aylan Kurdi, the 3-year-old Syrian boy whose body washed up on the beach in Turkey in September 2015. Chalker, the film I'm going to focus on here, was also inspired by that image, by Baruza's Iranian co-producer Savastani. But we also see a rippling out in the wake of that single image, an anxiety of influence through documentary film, a questioning of whether documentary, for example, can have that piercing impact of photojournalism, the force of a single image in the field of media witnessing. So, for example, Eva Orner, the producer of Chasing Asylum, a documentary about the camp on Nauru that was released in 2016, in her filmmaker's memoir, she says, quote, "In September 2015, Australians responded to the image of Aylan Kurdi on a Turkish beach, a great example of the power of photojournalism and a single image. And the Australian government announced a one-off increase in refugee numbers to take an extra 12,000 Syrians. But can a documentary film also produce empathy for those who suffer in the offshore camps when access to images is so carefully prescribed and regulated?" So, an anxiety about the role of documentaries in this field. So, one of the things we might want to think about then are what networks transport documentaries to a global witnessing public and position viewers as witnesses. The first is these films, each of these documentaries, move rapidly into global visual cultures via the institutional networks of human rights cinema and humanitarian activism. So this network is a transit lane where this Pacific theatre of documentary travels far. It expedites the promotion and reception of these films, and as we see in the case of Chalker and Chasing Asylum, this circuit is now deliberately scheduled into the production and dissemination of these films by the producers. Another important and related network is the Human Rights Film Network, which was established late last century by Amnesty International and has a charter that defines human rights films as films that reflect, inform on and provide understanding of the actual state of past and present human rights violations or visions and aspirations concerning ways to redress these violations. Now, this charter embeds a strong preference for testimonial documentary, for films that bear witness to the abuse of human rights and locate spectators, viewers as witnesses to authentic and truthful accounts told in the first person by whistleblowers, by asylum seekers, by islanders in the case of these three documentaries. So Eve Orner, Gillespie and Buchani and Savastani deploy rhetorical conventions associated with truthfulness in documentary film as this is understood in the terms of that charter. Testimonies of survivors bear witness to the camp in the first person. Interviews with professionals authenticate these accounts, and the authenticity of the handheld camera presents visible evidence. However, this Pacific theatre of documentary has to engage with a paradox, the paradox of invisibility, the coexistence of hypervisibility and invisibility. Thinking in terms of invisibility, this is a film that was almost impossible to make. Eve Orner says of her film Chasing Asylum, "I know why no one else made the film. You can't get access to the camps." So the constraints on media witnessing imposed by a rigorous border control regime that's becoming increasingly militarised in this period are imprinted on the pre- and post-production and distribution of Chaka. For Eve Orner, for example, to make Chasing Asylum, it was necessary to raise non-government funding. Given the risk of censorship attached to government funding schemes, Orner had to use crowdsourcing to raise money to make her documentary. In July 2015, when they were still making Chasing Asylum, the Australian Border Force Act came into effect to further regulate media witnessing about the camps, introducing punitive new laws that placed any employee of the camps who spoke of events on Manus or Nauru at risk of conviction. Even a filmmaker who shares that information or uses secret footage shot in the camps after July 2015 could be exposed. So invisibility and hypervisibility. In this Pacific theatre, the status of visible evidence is uncertain. It's a feature of the detention facilities on these islands where hypervisibility and invisibility coincide to capitalise on the insecurity of island detention. These shadowed worlds, identified by some researchers as black sites to accentuate the similarity with places like other sites such as Guantanamo, these shadowed worlds resist exposure. So, for example, just as we have to learn to read redactions, to work with the Nauru files, and to hear the silences, which is in the podcast The Messenger, so too in this theatre of documentary film, invisibility challenges the confidence in visuality that is a feature of human rights discourse and humanitarian activism in documentary filmmaking. Island detention constrains the production of media witnessing and witnessing publics. So these camps are at the one time hypervisible and invisible. Offshoring enables hypervisible enforcement practices and homogenising discourses on the one hand, stop the boats for example, whilst invisibilising the violence of offshore detention and suppressing humanising representations of asylum seekers in the camps. So as a concept, invisibility, that in the invisible and the hypervisible, captures a complex interplay of lines of sight that the securitising of migration requires. Hypervisibility and invisibility coexist recto verso. Securitisation of borders and extreme measures of border controls, such as Operation Sovereign Borders, require scenes of crisis and chaos where the sovereign state is at risk, require sites of militarised towbacks and interceptions, and spectacles such as the burning of boats at sea. At the same time, codes of secrecy maintain invisibility. For example, the access to smartphones and so on in the camps is something that is precarious. And what happens in and around these camps is actively hidden from view under specific legislation. So this insidious invisibility that the production of virtual witnesses through media and the creation of witnessing publics reveals and challenges. So the documentaries I'm thinking about in this Pacific theatre present visual and affective evidence that demands viewers become witnesses through watching, yet what they can show is always open to question. So before I say anything about Chowka, I think maybe we should look at the trailer so you have an idea of this documentary. It's 90 minutes. The trailer is 2.5 minutes. So let's get the sight and sound of the trailer. So let me say a little bit about the film. It was released to the British Film Institute screening in London in June 2017. And it's a co-production between Behrouz Bachani, who's a journalist, a working journalist who's in detention on Manus at the time this was made, and a co-producer, Aresh Kamali Savastani. And Savastani, in speaking to the film at the BFI, revealed that its inspiration was remote from Manus Island in the Pacific. It was the sight of so many children on boats in the Mediterranean Sea, he said, that led him to wonder what memories refugee children have about the sea. So Savastani, who lives and works in the Iranian diaspora in Eindhoven, and one of the interesting things about Chowka is it gives us an extended idea of the Iranian diaspora and connections between those in detention and Iranians in Europe and in America. So Savastani is in Eindhoven, and he had attended a workshop in Barcelona with the Iranian avant-garde director Abbas Kiarostami on the theme of the sea. So Savastani's first plan was to produce a film about children in detention at the Regional Processing Centre on Nauru. But families in the camp refused permission for their children to appear on camera, and they also refused to produce drawing samples that Savastani might use in a cinematic installation. So it was after this that Savastani went looking for a refugee with a camera in one of the island camps. And no surprise that he found Behrouz Bachani, the journalist who's worked in the camp on Manus, who I think is quite well known now. So Bachani, of course, wasn't in London for the BFI screening. He remained in detention on Manus, though his non-presence was a feature of the event in London. And the audience there hears that there were demonstrations about the Australian camps outside Australia House in London as this film was shown at the BFI. So we have an interesting scenario to imagine in the camp. We have Abdul Aziz Muhammad, who makes a podcast in liaison with Michael Green from the Wheeler Centre. So he is making a podcast with his smartphone in the middle of the night when reception is good from Manus, and at the same time Bachani is sending film, both of them using WhatsApp, sending film that he has made across to Savastani, who's at work in Eindhoven. Both of these things, the podcast and the film being made at the same time, both very different. Both produced despite the poor Wi-Fi connection from the camp. So Bachani films Chalka on his smartphone, a Galaxy GS6, but Savastani points out that voice messages are equally important to them as an enabling technology. We had to listen to each other, he says to the BFI audience, with no visual distraction, for example, as would happen on Skype. So Chalka, he says, was devised through 10,000 minutes of voice messages over 6 months. Had we used Skype, he suggests, the film would have been very different. The remoteness of the camp in itself was a gift, essential to the documentary. Now, Bachani is an exotic, erotic and spiritual presence in refugee activism now, narrating his experiences from the Manus camp in a variety of genres of witnessing. As a resourceful public intellectual, he creates multiple autobiographical performances tactically. For example, as a professional journalist, he's an authoritative political reporter on Manus who's frequently interviewed for print and online media transnationally. He's been interviewed in the New York Times, for example. Associations that represent the journalist profession keep watch over Bachani as an artist at risk. His Facebook pages and Twitter feeds engage with activists directly, and they present a very subjective micro-narrative from the camp. On Facebook, his followers, mostly women, respond emotionally to acknowledge his pain and suffering, some turning to Christian iconography to identify him as a martyr, remarking on his physical resemblance to Jesus. For a brief time during that extraordinary period at the end of 2017, when the men occupied the camp, Bachani created a disaster diary that chronicles his experiences intimately and viscerally. So Chalka then comes in as a further demonstration of various modes and media of self-fashioning by Bachani. And it's strange that in the trailer that they have it, you don't see the image of Bachani sitting at the fence, because that is how he's seen throughout the film, just sitting at the fence, looking through that grid, as well as interviewing several other asylum seekers in the camp. So Bachani summons a witnessing public through multiple synchronic encounters and creates an assemblage of narratives that experiment with different technologies of the self through intimate genres of diary, essay, media posts, and what we see here, a performative documentary. In a lead essay published in a collection of writings by refugees, Bachani actively associates himself with that image of Jesus and speaks about himself as being held in the Australian Guantanamo. So the film is part of this assemblage of different technologies of the self. Beruza's presence is seductive and openly so. One of the things I want to go on to work on after this is beginning to think about Beruza as a celebrity. So there's been quite a lot of work on celebrity humanitarianism to do with refugees. I'm not aware of another case where we might begin to think of a refugee himself or herself becoming a celebrity and being presented in that way. He's a recognisable presence across multiple media platforms, and I think we see him the number of ways he courts a witnessing public. So as a performative documentary, Chalka accelerates this celebrification and capitalises on the exotic and erotic associations of Bachani's presence. So here we see the world of the camp presented in terms of a highly aestheticised, embodied and personal perspective, drawing on Bachani's experience, emotion and memory. So the film draws the viewer into the camp with a focus not on events but on subjectivity, using expressive techniques, and you could hear these on soundscape, and the metaphors that feature in the trailer, the kitten, the butterfly, seeing through the grid, that break with the realist conventions of human rights documentary and draw on techniques and traditions of avant-garde art house cinema, most specifically drawing on the poetic humanist tradition of Kiarostami's films. In this way, the co-producer Savastani suggests they can represent the invisible violence of the camp, where time is an instrument of torture with no meaning, no beginning and no end. The chauka is the bird that marks the passage of time on Manus for the local people, and it's a prominent symbol of Manusian identity. Here in the film it becomes a symbol of insidious violence, of indefinite detention for the men in the camp. So the title, Chauka, Please Tell Us the Time, is an appeal for release from a limbo zone where time stands still. Savastani makes an interesting point that although Bucciani captured many shots of violence and suffering in the camp, these were entirely edited out of the final cut because the focus of the documentary is the banality and repetition of the camp. So just to conclude then with a few comments on this trailer, which we've seen, this represents the mode and genre of chauka, although as I say, it's strange that the trailer doesn't feature Bucciani himself, who's very much at the focus of much of what we see. It's a performative documentary. There are no voiceovers, no captions to a secure and authoritative interpretation, so it's a documentary that's seeking to work entirely in an evocative and poetic way. In this, it's entirely different to Chasing Asylum, the film Eva Orner makes about Nauru. It emanates from within the camp, focuses on subjective experience, and is fragmentary and impressionistic. This is a generic feature of performative documentary, which focusing on rhythms and forms rather than action or event. There is no action or event in this film. When I saw it in Brisbane, there were many activists there. When this is screened nationally, it's become an event, and many human rights groups and those who are protesting against asylum use these as events to circulate petitions and so on. And I wonder what they make of this film sometimes, because this is 90 minutes without any action or event. It doesn't appeal to an audience in the way human rights documentaries tend to do. So, for example, you see the constant return to some things you've seen: the kitten playing at the wire, the butterfly at the perimeter fence, the cigarette smoke Bucciani pours into the clouds of insecticide that billow around the camp constantly. So what the film is trying to do is to suggest what it feels like to experience this world in an embodied way. It's designed to work like a poem, says Bucciani. It's me looking at the camp in a poetic way. This is not like journalism, he says. Unanswered questions remain. Finally, just a couple of comments then on the soundtrack, which you heard, which is also important. A non-diegetic soundtrack which plays throughout the film, created by Savastani, is essential to the poetic effects of the documentary. So sight and sound are meticulously edited to produce temporal rhythms and spatial juxtapositions. It begins, as you heard, with the sound of the tolling of the bell, and there's a stifling austerity to the soundtrack throughout. Empty spaces of rests and rhythms, echoes between musical events. So images and sound in this documentary go nowhere. Everything remains trapped. Finally then, to think about this radical experiment in documentary cinema, I think it's fair to call it a radical experiment in terms of films about refugees and asylum seekers, is designed to capture the space and time of Manus. As a poetic and performative documentary, it tries to draw us into this space of bare life. What my thinking about it in terms of a Pacific theatre of documentary, you can hear, I see it in terms of that ensemble of 3 different documentaries, each of which bears the signature, interestingly, of the camp. it originates in. But beyond this, I see this as part of that larger testimonial archive that we can now see coming from the Pacific Camps podcasts, visual artefacts. We've got documentaries, we also have graphics, cartooning, and in print we have things like the Nauru Files and the significant grey literature about Manus Now, human rights reports, and so on. So the Pacific Camps, the Australian Pacific Camps, are producing an extraordinary set of testimonial artefacts. And Roseanne and I are hoping we can draw these together to really make a case that it's important in refugee studies, asylum seeker studies, to look at locations carefully. So I really welcome your comments, your questions. This is a work in progress. I think there's some obvious issues with talking about this as a Pacific theatre of documentary, and I'm still weighing up whether that's and strategically worth taking forward. Thank you.